The Dig, a TLW-style documentary narrative. There's a particular kind of patience you learn when you live alone with a dog. Not the kind that comes from discipline or training, though God knows I tried both, but the patience that grows in the spaces between understanding and surrender. The kind where you stop asking why and start watching what. Where you learn that sometimes the clearest communication has no words at all. I learned that patience in the summer of 2019, in a rental house on the far edge of a suburb I'd never heard of before my divorce papers were signed. The kind of place where the yards are big enough that you can't hear your neighbors arguing, where the trees have grown wild between the properties, where people move to disappear for a while without actually leaving. The house wasn't much, single-story ranch, pale yellow siding that had faded to something closer to bone, a porch that sagged on one side like a tired shoulder. But it had a backyard, nearly half an acre of overgrown grass and ancient oaks. And that was all I needed. Space, silence. Room to figure out who I was supposed to be now. I'd gotten Maggie 3 months after I moved in. She was 5 years old, a German Shepherd mix with one ear that flopped forward and scars across her muzzle that the shelter workers didn't like to talk about. Her file said she'd been found chained in a basement, underfed, probably used for breeding. The kind of past that leaves its mark in ways you can't always see. The shelter volunteer, a young woman with kind eyes and a practiced speech, told me Maggie was a project. Said she'd need time, consistency, someone willing to work through her fears. She didn't do well with sudden movements, didn't trust easily, had never really learned how to play. She's been waiting 8 months for the right person, the volunteer said, one hand resting gently on Maggie's trembling flank. She needs someone who won't give up on her. I remember looking into those amber eyes, watchful, guarded, carrying something heavy, and seeing a reflection I recognized. "I'll take her," I said. The first few weeks were hard in the way that healing things always are. Maggie would flinch when I reached for her too quickly. She'd press herself into corners during thunderstorms, shaking so hard I could hear her tags rattling from the next room. At night, she'd pace the hallway, unable to settle, like some part of her was still listening for footsteps that might mean danger. But slowly, so slowly I almost didn't notice, she began to trust. She started sleeping at the foot of my bed instead of in the hallway. Started bringing me her rope toy in the mornings, testing whether play was allowed. Started leaning against my legs when we stood together in the kitchen, her weight a quiet declaration. I'm here, you're here. That's enough. By early June, when the heat started pressing down on us, days like a hand and the backyard grass turned from green to gold, Maggie had become something I hadn't expected. Home. She had her routines, morning patrol of the fence line, nose to the ground, checking every corner like she was responsible for its safety. Afternoon naps in the shade of the big oak in the center of the yard. Evening sits on the porch while I read, her head resting on her paws, watching the light fade through the trees. It was simple, quiet, the kind of life I'd needed without knowing I needed it. And then one morning in mid-June, Maggie started digging. Not the playful kind of digging some dogs do, paws throwing up dirt in joyful chaos, a game of nothing. This was different, focused, deliberate. She'd planted herself near the back corner of the yard, beneath the shadow of the oldest oak, and she was digging like she was trying to reach something. I watched her from the kitchen window, coffee mug warm in my hands, and felt that first flutter of irritation. "Maggie, no," I called through the screen door. She paused, glanced back at me, and kept digging. I walked out across the dewy grass, my bare feet leaving dark prints in the morning silver. "Come on, girl, you're going to wreck the yard." She stopped when I reached her, sat back on her haunches, looked up at me with those amber eyes, waiting. The hole was maybe a foot deep, a foot wide. Nothing serious yet, just dirt and torn grass roots. I filled it back in with my heel, packed it down, and led her back to the house. "We don't dig holes," I said, like she understood English. "That's not what we do." She followed me inside, obedient, settled on her bed in the living room, closed her eyes, and the next morning she was digging in the exact same spot. I tried everything I knew to try. I filled the hole with rocks. She dug around them. I put a lawn chair over the spot. She moved it. I sprayed the area with vinegar and cayenne pepper, every home remedy Google suggested. She waited until it rained, then went right back to digging. Every morning, the same ritual. I'd wake up, pour my coffee, look out the window, and there she'd be, focused, intent, her front paws churning the earth like she was driven by something I couldn't see. At first, I thought it was prey. Maybe she'd smelled a mole or a rabbit burrow. But when I checked the hole, and I checked it every day, There was never anything there, just dark soil and clay and the occasional root. No tunnels, no nests, no bones or scent markers, just earth. "What are you looking for?" I'd ask her, standing over the growing hole, watching her dig. She never answered, just kept working. By the end of the first week, I was frustrated. By the end of the second, I was exhausted. Every morning, the same discovery. Every evening, the same filling and smoothing and promising myself I'd handle it better tomorrow. The hole grew deeper. 2 feet. Then 3. Maggie's focus never wavered. I started keeping her inside more, limiting her yard time, standing guard when I did let her out. But the moment I turned my back, the moment I went inside to refill my water or answer my phone, she'd be back at that spot, digging. Friends told me it was obsessive behavior, a trauma response, something from her past that had wired her brain wrong. "She needs more exercise," one said. "She needs a trainer," another suggested. "She's bored. Get her some puzzle toys." I tried it all, longer walks, mental stimulation games. A behaviorist who watched her dig for 20 minutes and told me it was probably anxiety, that I should consider medication. But Maggie wasn't anxious. That was the thing that nagged at me, that kept pulling at the edges of my understanding. When she was digging, she wasn't stressed or compulsive or lost in some trauma loop. She was focused, purposeful. Like she knew exactly what she was doing, like she was trying to tell me something. The thought came to me late one night in early July, lying in bed with the fan turning overhead and Maggie asleep at my feet. I'd been thinking about those first weeks with her, about all the things she couldn't tell me with words, her fear, her needs, her slow-growing trust. I'd learned to read her then, to watch instead of assume, to listen to what her body was saying even when her mouth was silent. When had I stopped doing that? When had I decided I knew better than she did what was worth paying attention to? The next morning, instead of filling the hole, I sat beside it. The yard was quiet in that early hour, dew still silver on the grass, birds just starting their calls in the oak branches above. Maggie was already there, of course, her paws dark with soil, the hole now deep enough that when she stood in it, her shoulders were level with the ground. I sat on the grass beside her and watched. She dug in bursts, 15, 20 seconds of focused effort, then a pause to look at me, then back to work. Her breathing was steady, her ears forward. Every few minutes, she'd stop entirely and press her nose into the hole, inhaling deeply like she was checking something. "What is it, girl?" I asked quietly. "What do you smell?" She looked at me then, and I swear something passed between us. Not understanding exactly, but recognition. The way two people might look at each other in a difficult moment and know, without words, that they're in it together. I got down on my knees and looked into the hole. Nothing but darkness and damp earth. The smell of clay and roots and something older, something that made me think of cellars and forgotten spaces. Maggie whined softly. Not distress, not frustration. Urgency. I put my hand in the hole, felt along the bottom, fingers spreading through the cool soil. About 4 feet down, maybe deeper, my fingertips brushed something that wasn't dirt. Something smooth, hard, flat. My heart did a strange thing in my chest, a skip, a catch, like I'd suddenly realized I was standing at the edge of something I didn't understand. I pulled my hand back, wiped the soil on my shorts, stared into the darkness. "Okay," I said to Maggie, my voice steadier than I felt. "Okay, let's figure this out." I went to the garage and got the shovel. Some decisions you make all at once. Others you make in increments, one small choice leading to another, until you're somewhere you never planned to be. This was the second kind. I didn't decide to dig. I just started. The first shovelful was easy, so was the second. By the 10th, I was sweating in the July heat, my shirt sticking to my back, my hands already forming the beginning of blisters. But I kept going. Maggie sat beside the hole, watching, waiting. At 5 feet, my shovel hit something solid with a dull thunk that sent a vibration up the handle and into my palms. I stopped. The sound wasn't wood or stone. It was metal, hollow. I got back down on my knees, brushed away the loose soil with my hands. The surface beneath was flat, rust red at the edges. And when I knocked on it with my knuckles, it rang like a drum. It was a door. Not a door to anywhere above ground. A door in the ground, built into the earth like a trapdoor or a hatch, with a handle on one side and what looked like a padlock rusted shut on the other. I sat back on my heels, breathing hard, staring at what I'd uncovered. The property was old. The house had been built in the 1960s, maybe earlier. It wasn't unusual for houses from that era to have storm cellars or old root storage. But this was in the back corner of the yard, 50 feet from the house, buried under decades of soil and grass, hidden, forgotten. Maggie whined again, softer this time, and pressed her nose against the metal surface. "Jesus," I whispered, "how did you know this was here?" She looked at me with those amber eyes, and I felt it again. That recognition, that quiet insistence. "Listen, pay attention. This matters." I called my landlord. He was an older man, retired, living in Florida now, and managing the property remotely. When I told him what I'd found, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "A door?" he said finally. "A metal hatch, buried in the backyard." Another pause. "I've owned that property for 15 years. Never heard anything about a cellar. Could it have been here before you bought it? Maybe. The previous owner was an elderly woman, lived alone for decades before she passed. I bought it from the estate. Never went through the whole property in detail." "Should I open it?" His answer came too quick. "Absolutely not. Could be structural issues, gas, mold. Hell, could collapse on you. I'll send someone out to take a look. Give me a few days." But a few days felt like too long. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that hatch, about what might be beneath it. Old storage, probably. Forgotten. Canning jars and rotted wood. Nothing important? But Maggie had known it was there. Somehow, she'd known. At 2 a.m, I gave up on sleep and went outside. The night was warm and thick, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Fireflies drifted through the darkness like tiny lanterns. Maggie followed me, silent, and together we stood at the edge of the hole I'd dug. In the ambient light from the porch, the metal hatch looked older than I'd thought. More weathered. The rust wasn't just surface, it had eaten through in places, leaving gaps where the darkness beneath showed through. I crouched down, pressed my ear against the metal, and I heard it, faint, almost imperceptible. A sound, not wind, not water. Something else. Something that made the hair on my arms stand up and my breath catch in my throat. It sounded like breathing. I jerked back, my heart suddenly hammering, and looked at Maggie. She was staring at the hatch, her body tense, her ears forward. She'd been trying to tell me for weeks, not that there was something buried here, that there was something alive. The rational part of my brain started shouting, "It's nothing. It's old pipes or, settling earth, or your imagination running wild at 2 a.m. But Maggie wasn't imagining anything, and I knew with a certainty that bypassed logic entirely, that something was wrong here, something more than old storage and forgotten history. I went back inside, grabbed my phone, and called 911. The dispatcher was professional, patient, probably used to confused calls in the middle of the night. "Ma'am, you're saying you found a buried hatch in your backyard?" "Yes." "And you think you heard something?" Yes, I think someone might be down there." "Someone?" "I don't know. I looked at Maggie, sitting beside me, calm now that I was finally acting. "My dog has been digging there for weeks. She knew something was there. And when I listened, I heard, 'Okay, ma'am, stay on the line. I'm sending officers to your location now.'" The police arrived 18 minutes later. 2 patrol cars, lights off, pulling into my driveway like they weren't quite sure what they were dealing with. I met them in the backyard, led them to the hole, explained everything as clearly as I could. One of the officers, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a skeptical mouth, knelt beside the hatch and listened just like I had. After a moment, she stood up and keyed her radio. "Dispatch, we're going to need fire rescue out here, and a supervisor." Her partner looked at her. "You heard something?" "Yeah." She looked at me, and there was something in her expression I couldn't quite name, something between surprise and concern. "Yeah, I did." What happened next unfolded like a strange dream. More vehicles arrived. Fire trucks, paramedics, people in uniform moving with purpose through my backyard, setting up lights and equipment. Someone brought an angle grinder to cut through the rusted padlock. Someone else brought a pry bar for the hatch itself. I stood back with Maggie, my arm around her shoulders, watching. "Ma'am, I need you to stay here," one of the officers told me. "We don't know what's down there yet." The hatch opened with a groan of protesting metal, and someone shone a flashlight into the darkness below. I saw the beam of light penetrate the opening, saw the way everyone leaned in, and then I saw the firefighter who'd been looking step back quickly, his hand coming up to key his radio. "We need EMS down here now. We've got—" He paused, looked back into the hole. "Jesus Christ, we've got a survivor." The world seemed to tilt then, to slide sideways into something I didn't have a framework for understanding. A survivor. Someone had been down there. Someone alive. The next hours were chaos organized by training. Paramedics descending into what turned out to be an old storm cellar, 10 feet deep, 8 feet wide, concrete walls covered in mold and darkness. Someone bringing up a stretcher, radios crackling with codes and medical jargon I didn't understand. And then I saw her. A girl. Maybe 16, maybe younger. Wrapped in blankets, her face pale and dirt-streaked, her eyes squinting against the lights, even though they dimmed them as much as they could. She was alive, conscious, and as they carried her past me toward the ambulance, she turned her head and looked directly at Maggie. Just for a second, and Maggie, brave, steady Maggie, stepped forward and touched her nose gently to the girl's hand. The girl's fingers closed around Maggie's fur, held for just a moment, and then she was gone, loaded into the ambulance, sirens starting up as they pulled away into the night. I stood there in my backyard, surrounded by emergency lights and official vehicles, and tried to understand what had just happened. A detective arrived as the sun was coming up. A tall woman with gray-streaked hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. She introduced herself, shook my hand, and asked if we could talk inside. We sat at my kitchen table, me, the detective, and Maggie lying at my feet, while the last of the emergency vehicles cleared out of my driveway. "The girl's name is Sophie Chen," the detective told me. "She's 17, been missing for 8 months. 8 months. The same amount of time Maggie had been waiting at the shelter for someone to give her a chance. She was taken from a mall parking lot last October. Her family never stopped looking. We've had every agency involved, every lead investigated. And she was here. The whole time, she was right here." "How?" My voice came out rough. I cleared my throat. "How did she survive that long? We're still piecing it together, but it looks like the cellar had been modified. Ventilation system, minimal supplies. He kept her. Now alive, was probably planning to..." She stopped, shook her head. "We'll get into that later. The important thing is, she's alive. Because of you. Because of your dog." She looked down at Maggie, and something softened in her expression. "Animals know things we don't. They sense things. This isn't the first time I've seen it, but it never stops surprising me." "Who did this?" I asked. "Who put her down there?" "The previous owner's grandson. He had access to the property, knew about the old cellar. We're executing a warrant for his arrest now." She looked at me steadily. "If you hadn't called when you did, if you'd waited for your landlord to send someone out in a few days like he suggested..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't have to. The detective left as the sun was fully up, promising to be in touch, leaving me with business cards and case numbers and a backyard that looked like a crime scene. I sat on the porch with Maggie, my hand resting on her head, watching the morning light filter through the oak trees. She'd known. For weeks she'd been trying to tell me, digging, refusing to stop, insisting that I pay attention to something I couldn't see or understand. And when I finally listened, when I finally trusted that her persistence meant something, we'd found a girl who'd been buried alive, forgotten, waiting for someone to hear her. I thought about all the times I'd dismissed Maggie's digging as a problem to fix, all the times I'd filled in the hole and led her away, frustrated that she wouldn't listen to me, when all along she'd been asking me to listen to her. "I'm sorry I didn't understand sooner," I whispered, scratching behind her scarred ear. "I'm so sorry." She leaned into my touch, patient as always. And in that moment, I understood something I'd been too lost to see before. Trust isn't just about being believed, it's about believing. The newspapers called Maggie a hero. The local news wanted to interview us. The shelter that had rescued her initially reached out, amazed and proud. Sophie's family sent flowers and a letter I read until I had it memorized, thanking us for bringing their daughter home. But none of that changed what mattered most. In the weeks after that night, I learned the rest of Sophie's story in pieces. How she'd been taken while walking to her car. How the man, the grandson, a quiet neighbor no one suspected, had kept her in that cellar, visiting periodically, planning things he never got to finish. How she'd survived on stubbornness and hope and the irrational belief that someone, somehow, would find her. I heard the dog, she told me later, when she'd recovered enough for visitors and had asked to meet Maggie. I could hear her digging, every day, and I just knew, that she was trying to tell someone. We sat together in a hospital room that smelled like antiseptic and flowers, Sophie's hand resting on Maggie's head, both of them calmer than I felt. "She saved my life," Sophie said simply. "She saved mine too," I told her, just in a different way, because that was the truth of it. Maggie hadn't just found Sophie. She'd taught me something I'd forgotten how to do. Pay attention. Trust what you don't understand. Believe that persistence in the face of dismissal might mean something more important than stubbornness. She'd taught me to listen. The hole in the backyard got filled in properly. The cellar was sealed. I planted a small garden there, sunflowers and wildflowers, bright things that reach toward light. Every time I see them, I think about darkness and discovery and the strange ways we find each other. Sophie recovered, slowly, the way all healing happens. She visits sometimes, on weekends, sits in the backyard with Maggie and me. We don't always talk about what happened. Mostly we just exist together, three survivors of different kinds of darkness, learning how to trust the light. Maggie still patrols the yard every morning, still checks the fence line, nose to the ground, making sure everything is safe. But now when she stops and focuses on a spot, when she insists that something needs attention, I don't dismiss her. I dig. Not because I expect to find buried cellars or missing girls every time, but because I learned that listening is an act of love, that trust is a conversation, not a command, that sometimes the clearest truths come from those who've learned to speak without words. There's a photo on my fridge now. Sophie took it on one of her visits. It's just me and Maggie in the backyard, sitting together in the grass near where the sunflowers grow. The light is golden. Maggie's looking at the camera. I'm looking at her. And if you didn't know the story, you just see a woman and her dog on a summer afternoon. But I know what I see. The moment I learned that rescue isn't a one-time thing, that sometimes the dog you save teaches you how to be saved, that the most important kind of digging isn't through dirt. It's through your own resistance to believing what you can't yet see. Some roads don't lead anywhere. They just teach you something on the way. And some holes, when you're brave enough to look into them, lead to light you didn't know was possible. Maggie taught me that. And every morning, when I watch her in the yard, patient and purposeful, and paying attention to things I can't perceive, I remember. The most profound trust isn't about being understood. It's about understanding. She's still teaching me, every day, and I'm still learning to listen. Because that's what love does. It digs, it persists, it refuses to give up, even when every reasonable voice says stop. It keeps going until it finds what matters, until it brings it home. That summer taught me that there are kinds of darkness we don't acknowledge, places where people disappear, not because they want to, but because someone decided to bury them. And there are kinds of persistence, animal and human alike, that refuse to let that darkness be the end of the story. Maggie knew Sophie was there long before I did. Maybe she smelled her. Maybe she heard something my ears couldn't catch. Maybe it was something else, something deeper, the way trauma recognizes trauma, the way suffering calls out to those who know its language. I don't know exactly how she knew, I just know she did. And she didn't stop until I listened. The landlord offered to let me out of the lease after everything happened, said he understood if I didn't want to stay in a house with that kind of history. But I decided to stay, signed a new lease, planted those flowers, because this house isn't defined by what was hidden here. It's defined by what was found, by the persistence of a scarred dog who refused to give up, by the faith of a girl who held on to hope in absolute darkness. By the moment when I finally stopped trying to control the narrative and started paying attention to what I was being told. The last time I saw Sophie was 3 months after that night. She'd graduated high school, was heading to college. She came by to say goodbye, sat on the porch with me while Maggie dozed in the sun. I want to work with animals, she told me. Maybe be a vet or work in rescue. That makes sense. People don't always listen to animals, she said quietly. They think they're just pets or property or things that exist for us. But they're not. She paused, searching for words. They're witnesses. They see what we miss. They remember what we forget. I looked at Maggie, at her scarred muzzle and her watchful eyes, and her patient, steady presence. Yeah, I said. They do. Sophie left for college, and life moved forward the way it does. The story made headlines for a while, then faded into the background noise of other tragedies and triumphs. The detective called occasionally with updates on the case. The man who'd taken Sophie was convicted, sentenced to life. Sophie's family sent Christmas cards, and Maggie and I kept living our quiet life in the house with the big backyard. She's 8 now, gray around the muzzle, slower on the stairs. But every morning, she still does her patrol, still checks the corners, still pays attention to things I can't see. And I let her. Because she taught me that the most important stories aren't always the ones we plan to tell. Sometimes they're the ones we stumble into. The ones we find by accident when we're lost and looking for something else entirely. I thought I was rescuing a dog when I brought Maggie home, but really, I was learning how to be rescued myself, how to trust, how to listen, how to believe that persistence matters even when you don't understand what you're persisting for. She dug for weeks before I understood what she was trying to tell me, and in doing so, she didn't just save Sophie's life. She reminded me what it means to be human, to witness suffering and refuse to walk away. To hear the voiceless and give them sound, to believe that beneath the surface of ordinary days, there are truths worth uncovering, even when it's hard, even when it doesn't make sense, even when every reasonable voice tells you to stop digging and move on. especially then. Because some holes need to be dug, some darkness needs to be brought into light, some voices, silent as they are, need to be heard. And sometimes the only way to find what's buried isn't through power or authority or expertise. It's through love, persistence, the stubborn refusal to give up on something that matters. That's what Maggie taught me. That's what she's still teaching me, every single day. In a backyard where sunflowers grow, where darkness once hid something precious, where a scarred dog decided that giving up wasn't an option, where she dug until someone finally listened, and by listening, changed everything.